how cold the air can be, how he can be lost so quickly through the window of opportunity, just like a draft in the night. See how words can twist and hands can ring like phones inside empty homes when nobody's there to hear. Oh, do you hear me, dear? Oh, cry me away, hey, 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 yeah. Cry me away, hey, hey, yeah. Cry me away, hey, 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 yeah. If you can, I don't believe.
Hey everybody, this is Richard Sachs. I'm host on Lost Arts Radio. Welcome back. It's nice to be with you again. And if you remember, those of you who are looking at the show back on the 16th of December last year, 2018, I think they called it, and we had Alex Newman on the show. Who was a foreign correspondent for the New American Magazine and an educator and a bunch of other things. And we were talking about the climate conference that was in Poland, because he had been on before from Paris for the Paris one, and he was in Poland telling us what was going on with that. And I said, if you could please come back when it's over and kind of wrap it up and go over the implications of what was decided and what was proposed and how all the different delegates were responding in the different countries and things, that would be super interesting. And I think it's a really important topic. And fortunately, Alex agreed to come back and do that with us. And he's here now. So we're going to continue. And welcome back, Alex. I'm really glad to be with you again. This is going to be a fun discussion.
Hey, well, thank you so much for having me, Richard. It's a pleasure to be with you, and really appreciate the opportunity to be on.
Yeah, so what I thought we could do is start with how the conference wrapped up and just kind of a recap of the major things that were done during it, and take your time and really give us a good orientation for what was going on over there, especially for the majority of people that never heard of it and don't know what it's about. So put it in context.
Sure. Well, thank you, Richard. And
sure.
I guess the final product, if you will, the deliverable, as they call it, was this massive agreement, 133 pages long, I think was the final version. And, it was much more dense than a normal one of these agreements. When the Paris Agreement came out, it was full of nonsense, but at least a normal person could read it and kind of get the idea of what was happening there. This is, mind-numbingly complex. But the reason is it's supposed to be kind of, they call it the rule book for the implementation of the agreement at Paris. And so it's kind of the specifics about, they call it transparency, right? Because people have positive connotations when they think of transparency. But what they're really talking about is how our government's going to track, measure, and report on the CO2 emissions of their citizens, sorry.
Yeah,
be careful. Yeah, so they want like a standardized way so that everybody can kind of be, tracked and measured. So there's that. Then they had a lot of discussions about how the wealth needs to be redistributed. The third world governments are starting to get nervous because, Obama came in and all these European governments, they said, oh, yeah, we'll be very happy to milk our taxpayers for $100 billion per year and hand it over to you. And, with Trump in office now saying, hey, we're not paying one more penny to this UN global warming thing, they're starting to get cold feet. And so that was a big topic of discussion. They say, where's this money going to come from? We want to see it. We want to make sure you're not just going to rename the foreign aid you're already sending us and call that climate aid. So that was a big topic. What do you think?
How much money are they talking about, just out of curiosity, that they want?
Well, the original agreement in Paris was $100 billion per year to start with. So obviously the United States is expected to pay the bulk of that. And Obama did start sending them checks, even though the federal law specifically prohibits that. There's been a federal law on the books since the 1990s saying that if any international organization accepts a non-state as a state, as a member state, then automatically dollars are not supposed to go there anymore. It has to do with the whole Israel-Palestine thing. The Palestinian, administrative whatever was trying to get recognized as a state.
Would you say once more slowly what that said? I think that's really important.
You're talking about the federal statute banning money?
Yeah. Is that new or is that old?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Richard. And in fact, very few people know about it, and that's how Barack Hussein Obama was able to get away with just flagrantly violating the law. But we had two statutes signed in the 1990s, U.S. Federal laws. One was signed by H.W. Bush, the other by Bill Clinton. And what they did, one of them said that no international organization that accepts a non-state as a member state can receive U.S. funding. And, of course, that was a reference to the Palestinian Authority.
A non-state as a member or a non-state as a member state?
Right. So they didn't use the Palestinian Authority by name, but that's what they had in mind. And they don't consider the Palestinian Authority to be a state. And what was happening was the Palestinian Authority, which of course is an entity funded by the U.S. taxpayer, was running around to these UN organizations saying, "Hey, we're a state. Let us join as a state." Okay. And so the U.S. Congress said, that's not going to be conducive to the peace process because, the Palestinian Authority wants to be recognized as a state, but first we want them to make peace with the state of Israel, then they can be a state, whatever. So they passed that law, and that prohibited any U.S. funding. The thinking was that no UN organization or no international organization would dare to accept the state of Palestine, quote unquote, as a member if they knew it was going to cost them all their U.S. funding. And for a long time, that held true. And then they signed another one where they specifically referenced the state of, or the Palestinian Authority by name. They said no international organization that accepts the Palestinian Authority as a member state is allowed to receive U.S. funding. And that was dormant for a very long time because the quote unquote state of Palestine was not accepted as a member to any organization. But that changed in 2011. UNESCO, under the leadership of Bulgarian communist Irina Bokova, and with a lot of lobbying by her and other regimes, was able to accept the quote-unquote state of Palestine as a member. And so in that case, they did stop sending federal money. Even though Obama loved UNESCO and loved what they were doing, the State Department cut off the funding for UNESCO. But then when the UNFCCC did, and actually I dug into this. I think I'm the only journalist in America who dug into this, so it's interesting that you ask about it. Yeah. But I contacted the State Department. I said, hey, Obama just sent $1 billion to this UNFCCC Green Climate Slush Fund, I call it. They call it the UN Green Climate Fund. Mm-hmm. And this is a part of the UNFCCC, which is an organization that has accepted the state of Palestine, quote unquote, as a member. How can you justify that in light of these statutes? And the response was incredibly revealing. If people want to, again, I think I'm the only journalist in all America who actually dug into this and got a response from the State Department. So you can read that at the New American's website. Okay. They said, well, the UNFCCC is more like a treaty than it is an organization. And so we don't consider that we're violating the law by sending, that's exactly how they put it. We don't think we're violating the law by sending them $1 billion. And of course they were. This is an organization. It has 1,000 employees. It's based in Bonn, Germany. And so, it was a flagrant violation of the law. But since Trump has been in office, he has cut off all that funding.
And it reminds me of the quote from Bill Murray in Ghostbusters. Well, it's actually more of a guideline than a rule, when he's talking about these things. I don't know if you remember. It's
typical bureaucraties, beating around the bush, trying to conceal what they're really doing. But it was ridiculous that Obama was sending, we're $22 trillion in debt, and these maniacs want to send money to a green climate slush fund so that Castro and Robert Mugabe can buy a nicer set of limousines or something for the climate, of course. It's absolutely ludicrous. But that's what's happening. And so, in Paris, I don't know if we talked about it at that time, Richard, but one of the first things that I reported on from Paris was that the G77 plus China, which is actually an alliance of 134 governments, ironically, by coincidence, at the moment is led by the quote-unquote state of Palestine. They sent out a ransom note at the beginning of the Paris thing, and they said, we're not going to play along with this unless they call them developed countries, right? What they really mean is taxpayers in America and Europe, agree to send us $100 billion per year. And, Obama and the European governments were tripping over each other, trying to find $100 billion. Oh, yes, master. Yes, master.
Yeah.
And they got those agreements.
Wow. Yeah. So how does that tie into what happened this time in Poland?
So this time around, there was, these third world governments that were expecting $100 billion per year. They call it climate finance. What they really mean is climate reparations so that we can have more private jets and things, bigger Swiss bank accounts. But so they started wondering, hey, Obama promised all these things, but Obama's not there anymore. And, Trump says global warming is a hoax. And He said, we're not giving another penny to the UN for this climate hoax. Now what? Where's this money going to come from? So they were very concerned, and they spent a lot of time trying to haggle with the developed country governments to figure out where they were going to get this money. And they said $100 billion was no longer enough. They wanted more. And so a lot of negotiating time in Poland was spent on, how are we going to extract $100 billion a year from people who have it to give to the UN and third world dictators. And they never really came to a good conclusion. In fact, the issue's still kind of up in the air. Germany has agreed, I think, to double the amount that they're going to extract from their serfs. But, that leaves, hundreds of billions of dollars in deficits in the years ahead, and they don't have it. So.
Wow. I would think France would agree to it right away, because they were talking about raising various kinds of taxes, including fuel, to pay for climate change related issues, right?
Yeah, and that blew up in their face like a bad trick cigar, right?
Yeah, these irritating people running around in yellow vests saying it wasn't a good idea.
Yep, exactly. And that really was, I think, one of the highlights of this whole UN conference, because this was supposed to be, a big celebration. France was complying with its commitments under the Paris Agreement by imposing these new global warming taxes on the people of France. And the people of France, the people of France, they're pretty tolerant when it comes to taxes. They pay some really outrageous taxes, especially by American standards, and they put up with it. But, this one was just too much. They said no more. And it united people on the left, on the right, in the middle, just people who couldn't afford their gasoline anymore, couldn't afford to keep their house warm in the winter. They said, no, we're not putting up with that anymore. And so that really, it was kind of like a shadow over the whole conference. You could tell everybody was beat up about it. And they did come up with some really good PR spin. They said, well, that's just because we don't have enough welfare payments to poor people. So what this really shows us is not that we got to hold off on the climate shenanigans. What it really shows us is we need even bigger government so that we can subsidize the poor people so that they can afford to pay their global warming tax. And that was,
right. Now that would be justice, social justice, I think, right?
Right. Take from the rich so they can pay their climate tax. Take from the rich so they can give to the poor so they can pay their climate tax. That's what they turned this into. Is that what this really shows us is the little buzzword was we need a just transition, and that means subsidize the poor so they can pay their climate taxes.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting how that makes people not want to do anything that would take you off of that arrangement, right? As far as motivation to do things that are work-related and creative and things like that. If you're getting paid to not do anything, then you want to make sure you keep not doing anything, or at least agreeing to everything. Yeah,
that's where they're going with this, right? Get more and more people dependent on the state. Now they're talking about the universal basic income, right? We're just going to turn the government into your, provider of your daily bread, and what happens when you disagree with the government? That's another question. But crazy times ahead, no doubt.
Yeah. So what are there some things that they did agree on that they came out of the conference with?
Yeah, they did. Again, they have this 133-page, they have all these different terms for it. You wonder who comes up with this stuff, but they call it the Katowice climate text, the Paris working group agreement, or the work program. They called it the Katowice package of climate agreements. And so it's a lot of it is just minor stuff. How are we going to standardize the reporting of CO2 emissions? How are we going to increase the ambition was another one of the big buzzwords, right? Everybody was talking about ambition, and they don't mean what you and I mean when we talk about ambition, right? Like ambition to succeed or do something good for the world, or your kids should have some ambition when they're doing their homework. They mean ambition in terms of how far governments are willing to go in terms of imposing additional taxes on their serfs, as far as imposing unpopular policies, as far as redistributing more wealth. And so they in this agreement, they try to map out the mechanics of how they're going to ratchet this up. Really, there was nothing huge in this agreement that wasn't in there before. If it gives you some idea, one of the big discussions, one of the big arguments was about whether the agreement should welcome the new IPCC report. The IPCC, for those who don't know, is the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's like their pseudo-scientific body that gives us, the science, as they call it, and the science demands that if we don't submit to the UN within 12 years, we're all doomed. Right. And so there was this big, massive brouhaha, right? Headlines all over the world. Huge disagreement in Poland as countries scramble to come up with. So you had Trump, the U.S. government, the Russian government, the Saudi government, and the Kuwaiti government refused to go along with the consensus. The consensus was that the Poland agreement should welcome the new IPCC findings. These new IPCC findings, to summarize, we're all doomed. It's your fault. But if you give us all your money and all your freedom within the next 12 years, hopefully everything's going to be okay. And so these 4 governments said, no, we don't agree to welcome those findings, partly because it's pseudoscience, junk science. In a few days, I'm actually going to go interview Niels Axel Morner. He's a Swedish scientist who served as the reviewer for the sea level section for the IPCC. And he told them, hey, this is all wrong, guys. This is full of errors. We're not going to publish this. And they ignored him, and they published it anyways. And so he resigned, and he said, I'm not going to participate in this fraud. The sea level is not rising. There's no crisis of sea level rise. Maximum, we're talking 20 centimeters by the end of the century, and no city in the world is going to have any problem with that. You guys are just fear-mongering and peddling lies. So, that'll give you some idea of the IPCC. So anyways, these 4 governments said, no, we don't welcome it. We'll welcome that the report was completed, but we won't welcome the findings. And so, there was just hours and hours of haggling over whether we're going to welcome the report or welcome the findings of the report. So, I mean, that's how silly this kind of stuff is. And they ended up welcoming the completion of the report, but not the findings of the report.
So it sounds like the agreement, 133 pages or something that you mentioned, was written in words of art by attorneys. I mean, if it's that hard to read, and just so people know, words of art means that the attorneys get to redefine commonly used English language so that you have no idea what it really means, but it still sounds like what you're used to, so you think you know what it means, and you'd have to have all the definitions, otherwise you really don't know what you're reading.
That's
and
exactly.
I'm wondering, is that what it is?
It's exactly what it is, Richard. And when you read this, you realize, even attorneys would have a ridiculous time trying to read this thing. Yeah, it's we commit to negotiating in 5 years under subparagraph C of the Jomtien Declaration that was agreed to in 1990. Subparagraph A. You just can't read this stuff, even as a professional trained to understand this. It's just ludicrous. But the long and the short of it is they agreed to continue this fraud, right? They're going to be meeting again in Chile next year. They agreed to keep the bandwagon rolling, even though the wheels are falling off. And, the wheels are falling off. And I think there's kind of a realization dawning on these people now that, we're still going through the motions. We've been doing this for 24 years, but this thing's falling apart. As just one example, they were supposed to meet in Brazil next year, and this new Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, said, "No, you guys aren't coming here next year." Sorry. he, like Donald Trump, has said that global warming is a hoax. His foreign minister, brilliant guy, he says that the global warming hypothesis is actually just a Marxist hoax to break down Western civilization, and no serious scientist believes this nonsense. So, there is, I think, a slow realization that the more extreme these people become with the climate hoax, the more people are realizing that, oh my goodness, this is all a giant charade. But, they're still, it's an integral part of the New World Order that they're building. So they and they've invested so much of their credibility into this that they kind of have to keep it on life.
You can't drop it now. They are trying to ease over into climate change, though. So just in case it doesn't get warm fast enough, then as long as it's changing radically, like day to day, and they're making sure of that with geoengineering to make it as radically unstable as possible. And I think it would be, I know this will never happen, but it would be interesting to see what the people in that meeting would do if somebody they thought was an acceptable delegate came up with the right credentials and started saying, we have the proof that man-made climate change is real, and it's a threat to all life on Earth, and it's called geoengineering, and here's how it works. I wonder how fast they would try to, put a bag over that person's head and get rid of them, or what they would do.
Well, in 2012, Lord Monckton, who, for those who don't know Lord Monckton, he's a peer of the realm over in the United Kingdom. And he got dressed up as an Arab in 2012, and somehow he got some credentials, I think, for Qatar or for one of the Arab governments. And he strolled on into the plenary session, took the mic, and started saying, "This whole thing is a big hoax. You guys are all full of it. We all know it. And you stop lying to us." And wow. I think he's been banned ever since from these UN conferences.
Yeah, I think they tried to ban him from everything, actually.
Yep.
Get his driver's license, whatever you can do.
Yep.
So with what they agreed on, even though nobody except the writers actually knows anything that it really says because of the definitions missing. What's the plan to implement what they agreed on?
So the way the Paris Agreement is structured is every national government is supposed to come up with, they call it a nationally determined contribution. And so each national government is supposed to say, we're going to do this for the climate, right? And so every government comes up with a plan. We're going to slash CO2 emissions by 20% below 1980 levels by 2050. Just to pick an arbitrary example. And then they're supposed to file this pledge with the United Nations. Now, in this Polish agreement that they came up with, they've kind of standardized some of this stuff, and then they're supposed to live up to those obligations. The reality is nobody has lived up to these obligations. Ironically, the United States has, not through any weird policies, just because natural gas and some of the new energy forms we're using happen to emit less CO2 than other forms that we used to rely on, like coal. But, even the European governments that signed up and made these grandiose pledges are not going to be able to meet their commitments. The third world dictatorships, nobody ever expected them to do anything anyway. China was like, we might start considering reducing our emissions by 2030 or something, right? So hard to not meet that pledge. Right. But that's what's supposed to be happening. But, of course, it's all a big fraud. I mean, it's all as fraudulent as the pseudoscience that underpins it all. Nobody actually expects these governments to do these idiotic things. Of course, they expect the U.S. government to hand over the money and shred our economic productivity. But, the other governments, it's really just window dressing. And what it really was supposed to do was deindustrialize the Western world and ship all this productive capacity over to China. So you had China making these pledges like, we're going to cut CO2 emissions, maybe we'll peak in like 2030. So in other words, we're going to keep burning all the coal we want, et cetera, for another 15 years from when they signed it in Paris. And in the United States, Obama said we're going to drastically cut CO2 emissions. We're going to shut down all these power plants. He actually told us, one of the few honest things he said, electricity prices are necessarily going to skyrocket under my plan. And actually, He was telling the truth, right? So what's going to happen? And
he said that anybody who wanted to start a coal power plant would go broke.
That's right.
I watched him say that. Yeah.
That's right. And he said it on television. It's unbelievable. And so what's going to happen when an American company is trying to manufacture something in the United States, and they could either go broke trying to afford electricity or move to China where electricity is going to be cheap and labor is going to be cheap because they have slaves that you can rent out from the regime. Well, obviously all the productive capacity, all the production is going to move over to China, where of course they have no environmental controls, right? You can dump the mercury right out into the, baby formula factory water. And so of course that was the goal all along, is to build up the totalitarian governments of the world and the United Nations, and to drastically reduce the standard of living, the freedom, the prosperity of the American people, the people of the West, and do it all under the guise of saving the climate, and of course empower all these United Nations institutions in the process. So all of that is still ongoing. But as I said back in 2010, I think the man-made global warming hoax is dying slowly. This notion that man's CO2 emissions control the Earth's temperature, and that they have any idea, if we reduce them by 20%, what that's going to do to the temperature. But the broader hoax continues to move on.
Right. So, did most of the European countries agree to this, to the new paper that came out?
Almost every government in the world did. Yeah. And what's really weird, Richard, is that even the U.S. government agreed to this package, which is very strange because this is supposed to be to implement the Paris Agreement. And President Trump has said we're getting out of the Paris Agreement. So there's something that needs to be explained here. And I still have not been able to figure out all the details.
So who was the U.S. delegation to this meeting?
Yeah, well, it was very interesting what happened with the U.S. delegation. On the one hand, they were almost trolling this thing, right? They sent a panel over there to have a side event where they were talking about how great coal and oil and how we're going to continue using these things. And
was that the same group as was the delegation to this meeting, or different?
Well, the U.S. government sent a ton of people, and they sent, a team of technical negotiators to work on this agreement and all the rest of it. And I talked to some of them, and they also sent a panel of officials, including some high-level officials, Assistant Secretary at the Department of Energy, things like this. And they held a panel, which was very well attended. literally promoting the benefits of coal and oil and natural gas and so-called fossil fuels, and how great they were and how they liberate people from poverty, and how it's not fair that somebody in Africa has to cook their meal on dung in their little mud hut while these fancy people run around on private jets to lecture us about riding our bikes. So it was a pretty decent panel. I thought it was unfortunate that they paid some lip service to this whole notion that CO2 emissions are bad. They're like, well, we're cutting our CO2 emissions even though we're burning lots of fossil fuels, as if there was something great about cutting CO2 emissions. I did get to ask them that question. Actually, I said, why are you guys playing along with this? Your boss says climate change is a hoax. Why are you playing along with this man-made warming theory?
Yeah.
And they appreciated the question. Actually, he said, thank you very much for that. But, so that was the public side. But then behind the scenes, you had U.S. government employees, mostly from the State Department, working in these negotiations. And, I actually wrote to the State Department. I said, what are you guys doing, with all these negotiators here? The guy I talked to from there actually was put in place under Obama. And I said, why are all these negotiators here? We're going to back out of this ridiculous deal anyways. What are you guys wasting tax money sending people here for? And they said, well, we're defending U.S. national interests, which, of course, they would say. And I guess in theory, they didn't say this directly, but in theory, a future U.S. government could rejoin. And so they wanted to try, what they wanted us to come out of with this statement they sent me was that in theory, a government could rejoin. And so we want the rules to be, as pro-U.S. as possible, which, this coming from the team that sold us out in Paris and basically agreed to destroy our economy and build up China doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. But, I even asked the executive director of Greenpeace. They had a press conference at the end. And I said, hey, my president, I'm from America. My president says that the man-made warming hypothesis is a hoax. I'm curious, how did the U.S. delegation contribute to this? And the response was really interesting. They said, oh, well, the U.S. delegation, along with the Chinese delegation, they've been very constructive. And, that is a red flag if I ever heard one. So, I still don't have all the details, but a lot of fishy stuff going on.
So, but I'm maybe not understanding. You said initially that the U.S. and Russia and some other countries didn't go along with it, but then you just said that the U.S. delegation agreed to it. So how does that?
Oh, I'm sorry, Richard. Yeah, the confusion comes from they didn't agree with a particular word choice in the agreement. So this was they were arguing about this is 133 pages, but there was one clause in one section about whether the governments involved in this, the Conference of the Parties, is what COP24 stands for, the 24th Conference of the Parties, whether the parties should welcome either the findings of the new IPCC report or just the fact that the report was completed. So the U.S. government and Russia and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait said we don't agree to welcome the findings of the report, right? So in other words,
they did agree to go along with the whole thing when it was over, and when it said that one. Okay,
they did. Yeah. So they got their way on that issue. They didn't. The final agreement did not welcome the findings. It welcomed the completion of the report. But they did agree to the overall package in the end. And it's not a treaty. Our Senate is not going to ratify this. But the U.S. government historically treats these things as if they were, if not legally binding, they implement them anyways. So.
Well, it's like they said for Agenda 21. It's totally voluntary, so you don't have anything to worry about.
That's what they say all the time, and the fact is, they're very subtle. But these agreements that they're coming up with, they don't call them treaties, so that they don't have to be ratified by our Senate, because they know our Senate would not ratify something like this. In fact, a lot of these UN conferences that I've been to, U.S. senators have showed up and said, "Hey, you guys are all wasting your time. There's no chance this is getting through the Senate." But this time around, they didn't do that. And, when Obama signed the Paris Agreement, they specifically said this is an executive agreement. This is not a treaty. So the U.S. Senate doesn't get to weigh in on it.
Wow. And what's the definition of executive agreement? Treaty by the president, right?
Exactly.
On behalf of the country.
Exactly. And so you can search your Constitution all day and you'll never find the term executive agreement because it's not in there. Right.
Right.
But so what they do is they pass these agreements, and they treat them as soft law. They say, oh, it's just voluntary, it's non-binding, you don't have anything to worry about, just like with Agenda 21 and with Agenda 2030. And then little by little, they start implementing them. They sign executive orders that all the heads of the agencies should consider this in all of their decision making. And so gradually it gets incorporated into U.S. law, into U.S. regulatory systems, into U.S. court decisions, and gradually it becomes a part of the system that governs us.
So how do you see this kind of agreement that everybody just agreed to, that's totally voluntary, and that means everybody's going to do it? How is that tied into the bigger picture of Agenda 21? And the reason I ask that is because I think one of the reasons that as a population we're trained not to really be able to understand anything is because in so-called education in America now, except for the school that you're in and a few like that, we're taught to be specialists and to be really proud of knowing a lot about an area that's so narrow. We have no idea of the context or implications of what we're doing, and we're trained to be tools for a larger system doing negative things without even knowing it. And that comes from having too narrow of a focus and tunnel vision. So a lot of the people serving these things don't even know they're doing anything bad. They're just really proficient experts. But if their vision widened, they wouldn't even go along with most of the stuff they're doing. So, coming from there, if you take the agreement that just came out of that conference, how does that relate to Agenda 21 overall?
Yeah, well, great question, Rich. And, I think what's happening here, Agenda 21 and more recently Agenda 2030, these are kind of like the overarching framework for how they want to design the global governance system that they're building, right? And for people who doubt that, just read the agreements, right? They're talking about restructuring our education system. They're talking about restructuring our private property, our land use, our zoning regulations. They tell you every aspect of every human life is going to be affected by this. And so the climate hoax is one of the key justifications that underpins all of this. If the climate hoax went away, if the man-made global warming hypothesis was exposed as totally irrelevant, it would take away one of the major justifications for all of this. And so all three of these are kind of moving in parallel toward the same goal, and that is creating an environmental system of governance. And the environment part of it is one pillar, if you will, of the global governance structure. And in that pillar, the key mechanism at this point is the climate part, right? Because, the biodiversity part, it's really hard to get people riled up about biodiversity, right? Oh my goodness, a lizard that no one's ever heard of and no one's ever seen is going to be extinct. Oh my goodness, please restructure my life to protect that lizard. People just don't get that enthusiastic about that. But when you tell them, when you terrorize little children and tell them, hey, your mommy and daddy are going to die and your town is going to be flooded because of your CO2 emissions, right? That's more persuasive.
And you're going to have out-of-control forest fires and earthquakes and fires like they just had in California. Exactly. Droughts,
tornadoes.
And
just pick your biblical disaster, and it's going to happen, and it's because you drive an SUV, right?
Exactly.
Is the thinking. And so all of these work in parallel. In Agenda 2030, one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030 is a set of 17 goals, and one of them is climate action, right? Protecting the climate and all this, yada, yada, yada. And so the climate element of this is a crucial part of the broader goal. And if you want to know what the broader goal is, then you look at Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030, because then you see how they're talking about using things like climate and things like ocean pollution and things like this as an excuse, as a pretext for imposing tyranny, for restricting your freedom, for restricting your ability to produce wealth, for restricting your ability to even support yourself, and to make decisions for your own life as opposed to having those decisions made for you. And so on the one hand, you have the pretext, and the global warming hoax is a key pretext. And on the other hand, you have the desired outcome, which is totalitarian policies that govern every aspect of your life. And it's not just the environmental component of it. They use terrorism as the kind of security component, right? That's why we need to spy on you and we need to regulate the internet.
I heard terrorism is coming directly from global warming.
Oh, that's the new thing, right? And so is mass migration, right? I interviewed
exactly
one of the UN International Organization of Migration spokespeople, and they said, oh yeah, we expect that very soon there's going to be 150 million people headed for America and Europe as a result of climate change. And
it's getting too hot in the desert, right? And they can't live there anymore.
And the irony of this, Richard, we reported, I think back in 2010, the United Nations had predicted, I think in 1990, maybe it was 1995, that there was going to be 50 million was the number they came up with, climate refugees heading out of specific parts of the world. And they even showed you on a map where the climate refugees were supposed to come from. And some genius guy decided, I forget the guy's name now, he works for a newspaper out in Asia. He said, well, let's see what happened, actually. And he did the numbers, he looked at the thing. Every single one of these areas that was supposed to be mass producing climate refugees ended up growing massively. Right? They had a population explosion. They didn't produce a single climate refugee. And yet now we're being told again, hey, 150 million refugees headed towards you because of global warming or climate change.
Well, maybe they were going in there so that they could emigrate out of it, to become climate. The other thing is that you can prove climate change because, I'm pretty sure there have never been mass conflagrations like there have been in California recently, anywhere else in the world. And you're getting extremes all over the place. I mean, even where I am in Arizona, we just had this huge cold spell, which was pretty much unprecedented for this early in the year. And it just shut down, ability to travel and things in our area for a few days. And obviously climate change. And actually, I agree that it is. It's being systematically done by geoengineering. And I think they haven't gotten around to mentioning that yet.
Yeah, and I think it's an area that needs to be explored. The other day somebody sent me a video of this guy from Harvard saying, hey, I have this geoengineering idea. We're going to go put stuff up in the atmosphere that's going to darken the sun. Yeah, tens of thousands of people are going to die. But, it's for the greater good. I'm thinking, what, did I just hear that guy? I had to play it again a couple of times to make sure I heard what I thought I heard. He was saying tens of thousands of people were going to die from his little geoengineering idea. You had the head
and
of
the others will all remain in perfect health, though, right?
Right. Yeah. If you believe that, I've got some nice beachfront property in Nebraska, too. But it's out in the open now. You have the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, writing on his Twitter that, hey, we need to start pouring more money into geoengineering. So they're coming out and telling you we're going to be doing these crazy things to the environment, to the atmosphere, under the guise of climate. And this is something that needs to be explored. This is something that everybody needs to be taking seriously. Who gave them the right to put a bunch of stuff up in the atmosphere or to do other changes to the Earth? This is not their planet, right? And it's just before the show we had been talking about Dane Wigington, who's done I think a lot of the work in this area. I hope people will go and see some of the work he's done. And this is something that we all need to be very concerned with.
Yeah, geoengineeringwatch.org is a really great site, and it's got massive detailed information on the spraying that's going on. It takes it mostly from the climate point of view, and it's got high-definition videos all over of these nozzles retrofitted on planes, just billowing solids out of the spray nozzles. It's really not a question anymore whether it's going on. Just really what's it going to do? And we've had Clifford Carnicom and other people on who have analyzed the spray residue, and it's not just toxic metals. Aluminum, barium, and strontium are the main ones of those, but it's also all kinds of bioweapons are in there, and cross-domain bacteria, bizarre life forms on a microscopic level. There's a lot more to it. I mean, it's pretty important stuff, I think. Yeah.
No, I mean, this is serious stuff, and people who naively think, oh, they would never do that. You don't know who you're dealing with. I mean,
no,
these people
which is an interesting question. I mean, who is it that is doing all this Agenda 21 stuff, which includes the climate change panic, and give up your rights and pay the new carbon exchanges to save the earth and stuff like that? I mean, who do you think is doing all this?
What I would do is not to toot my own horn, but I would recommend that people go get a special issue of the New American Magazine that we did. It was the first issue of 2018. It was called Deep State Pulling the Strings from Behind the Scenes. And what we did is we take that question, who is they, right? Because you always hear they are doing this, they are doing that. Who is they? And we break it down in a series of articles. So we start with, the deep state within the government, the corrupt bureaucrats that are, self-serving, working for their own benefit. I can't remove them. This kind of elitist cadre of big government-loving, freedom-hating bureaucrats. Then we go, intelligence community. So, we have communists, people supporting Islamic terrorism, people spying on every American, running around openly killing people, right? You have the head of the CIA and the NSA in public bragging that they kill people based on their metadata, right? So you better watch out with your metadata for future reference. You don't want a drone on your head. So we expose those. And then we get into, the semi-secret organizations. By that, I refer to the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group. Both of those have a website. They're not theoretical. They're actual organizations with actual lists of members and steering committees and so on. The Trilateral Commission is another powerful one. And, the leadership of the quote-unquote conservative establishment, the Republicans are involved in these groups, and the leadership of the so-called liberals and the so-called Democrats are involved in these groups. Doesn't matter if your president comes from the Republican or Democrat Party, the cabinet is always going to be packed with members of these organizations. Many times the presidents themselves will come from these organizations, although Donald Trump has been a major exception to that rule. We spend a lot of time talking about also the money men, who are a criminal investigator will always, when you want to solve a crime, what do? You follow the money, right? So what we do in that article is we follow the money. Of course, there's George Soros. Everybody knows about George Soros and the Rockefellers. And then we talk about, where did George Soros get his start? Well, he got money from the Rothschild dynasty. What is the Rothschild dynasty? Well, it's another rabbit hole that you need to go down, an incredibly powerful banking family. And then, of course, the secret societies, right? You really can't have a discussion about who is they without talking about the secret societies. So we break down the Bohemian Grove as one example. You can go on YouTube and watch a video that Alex Jones took when he snuck into the Bohemian Grove. This is 2,500 of the most powerful men in the world, only men, meeting in the redwood forest of Northern California once a year. Literally every Republican president since 1920, with the exception of Trump, has participated in this Bohemian Grove thing. And Alex Jones snuck in there one year and filmed them doing this. They call it the cremation of care ritual, and they wear these goofy robes and they chant about forest spirits, and they have this 40-foot stone owl in the middle of the forest, and they burn what they claim is a human effigy, an effigy of a child. It's not a real child, it's an effigy of a child. Okay, whatever they're burning, it's really weird. Okay, somebody needs to explain what's going on there. And then you have groups like the Skull and Bones. My friend Charlotte Isabet, her dad and her grandfather were members of this organization, and when they passed away, she leaked all the documents to one of America's greatest historians, Anthony Sutton, and he wrote a book about it called America's Secret Establishment. And what you realize when you see this is that they have been trying to control both sides of the debate, going back, centuries, right? Going back to the 1800s. And a perfect example of that was the 2004 election, where on the one hand, you could choose George W. Bush, who was a member of the Skull and Bones, as the conservative, the Republican. And then on the other, you could choose the other member of Skull and Bones, John Kerry, the supposed liberal. Right, and so that's how they do. They control both sides of the debate. Another member was William Buckley, right? The guy who basically spent his entire career as a conservative, attacking and maligning other conservatives who were actually serious about restraining the size and the scope of government, and defending the United Nations and defending abortion, and defending on and on and on the list goes. Right. So it's a very nefarious network, and if people want to learn more about who is they, who is really behind all this stuff, and this very much applies to the climate scam as well, get a copy of that special issue. We have it available for free online, all the articles. If you want actual physical copies of it, I encourage you to get them. Those are available through the website as well. You can order, 100 or 1,000 at a time if you want. I think we're on the 4th or 5th printing now, so we're really getting it out there. and give it to your congressman, give it to your state representative and your sheriff and your local newspaper editor and the local business people in your town, because that's how we're going to wake people up and expose these people. And I think that's really the only thing we can do at this point. We can't fight these people. Violence, of course, would not be an answer to anything, but we can expose them. And I don't think they can continue doing what they're doing if people know who they are and what they're up to.
So you're talking about one specific issue in particular of the New American Magazine, right? How do people identify that issue?
It's called The Deep State Pulling the Strings from Behind the Scenes, and I might even have a copy here.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I don't have it next to me.
Okay, but they can go by the title. What's the date of that issue?
It's January. I think it's January 8th of 2018. And if you type into any search engine, Deep State Special Issue, the New American Magazine, or Alex Newman, you'll come right across it. And you can get it any which way you want. All the articles are posted online just as a normal website. You can also get the PDF of it and just download that. You can get it as a book on Kindle, right? So you can download it to your whatever device you use to read those things.
Okay.
And so get a copy of that, and you'll find out exactly who they is and what we can do to stop them.
Yeah, sounds great. And the other thing that I think is really relevant, we talked about the climate agreement that just came out of Poland in relation to Agenda 21, but also there are more things happening now that the Democrat Party has taken over the House. Just, what was it, yesterday, I think? At the time we're recording this anyway, it was just yesterday. And one of the things that they're really excited about doing for saving the earth is called the Green New Deal. And I know that you have been teaching kids about economics, I think, to some degree, right?
That's right, yeah. I teach them advanced economics. So
when you look at something like the Green New Deal, and there are millions of people thinking that this is going to be fantastic, we'll finally get rid of all the environmental problems. We'll also get rid of the economic problems, because things have been really unfair for a long time. And a lot of other problems, too. We'll get rid of the nasty oil industry, and I forget what else. There's a lot of things they're going to get rid of and bring in, what in other contexts are called basically utopia. But here you could just say a free and just society where everybody is prosperous and has a lot of money and can get whatever they want. And everybody also has a job, and everybody is also guaranteed free, excellent health care, which is all paid. It's all free because it's paid for by the government, which has unlimited money. So how would you say would be a good way to understand that proposal? Because they're really going to try to get this done in Congress now, with the House anyway.
Yeah. Well, I would say just look at the people who've made these promises in the past and see how they've delivered. This is the kind of rhetoric that Fidel Castro used. This is the kind of rhetoric that Robert Mugabe used. This is the kind of rhetoric that Chairman Mao used, right? Oh, we're going to make everything equal, and the government is going to help you, and the government is going to give you this and that, right? They're just going to go to their money tree and shake it a little bit so that they can buy you everything that your heart desires, right? And I think the best way to understand this, and I just saw this metaphor recently, and I just made a light bulb go off. It's like a mouse trap, right? And instead of a block of cheese to get the mouse, you put free stuff. And the people, they don't understand how do you get the free stuff? Well, you get the free stuff. Oh, that sounds like fun. And then you're stuck. Yeah,
it's like, why haven't we been given this free stuff before? This is the obvious answer to everything. You wouldn't even have to work if you don't want to.
That's right, yeah. And it applies to all these kooky ideas. Well, let's just raise the minimum wage to $15. Well, think about this for a minute. Why don't we just raise the minimum wage to $1 trillion? What do you hate, poor people? You don't want them to be trillionaires? You know what? We'll just make it $1 trillion per hour, and we'll all be trillionaires, and all our problems will be solved. Right?
Anybody against that has to be a racist.
and a sexist, and a homophobe, and everything else. Exactly. I mean, that is the level. And, unfortunately, Richard, this goes back to education. There are now people who are naive enough, who are gullible enough to believe this stuff. And it's because they have been so heavily indoctrinated. They've been deliberately deprived of not just the knowledge that they need to make informed, proper decisions, but even the tools, the mental tools to be able to think through something and say, does that make sense? Is that logical? Is that reasonable? Does 1 + 1 really equal 2? And so now we have millions of people, probably not quite a majority yet, but they're working to change that as quickly as they can, who are just completely oblivious to reality and to basic math and to basic limits on resources. Basic.
Well, I think they've also been shown in the real world that the United States can just declare a war to destroy all these countries in the Middle East, for example, and destroy Libya and destroy Iraq and all these things so they can be rebuilt and destroyed again, and the U.S. can end up ruling all these countries. They don't have a problem with finding the money for those wars. It's always there, and that seems to prove that, well, if money is always there just by declaration, why not declare it peace and prosperity for everybody and use the money for that?
Yep. And, I think what they're missing here is that the U.S. government is now beyond broke, right? They borrowed $22 trillion to do a lot of this stuff. That doesn't even include the $200 trillion, the estimated $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. There has never been a bigger debtor in the history of all of humanity. There's never been an entity that has had as much debt as the U.S. government. So, the idea that we can just pile on more debt and everything's just going to be fine. That is so ridiculous. And they have a point. These wars are outrageous. They shouldn't have happened. We probably could have spent the money on better things, like not taxing it and borrowing it to begin with. But the idea that because we can fight illegal wars all over the world, we can also, create a utopia with government money. It's a logical fallacy, and it's a very dangerous one, because in addition to all the problems that come from wasting all that money, you make people dependent, you ruin incentive structures, you destroy people's morals, and you end up destroying civilization.
Do you remember? You've taught American history a lot, right? Do you remember I'm not sure if it was a president or one of the high officials in the U.S. government that said, it doesn't matter because we're borrowing it from ourselves?
I do remember hearing that. And I think there's a lot of people out there who think that, right? Well, it's okay to borrow lots of money because
they don't see anything wrong. We have trillions of dollars of debt in the U.S. government. First of all, something I object to is, and I do it all the time, saying we. The U.S. government is absolutely not we.
That's right.
I don't remember personally destroying Libya or, any of the other things that they're involved in like that. That's them. But they, if you want to call it that instead of we, have borrowed trillions of dollars, and McDonald's is still open and there's still movies and football games and everything. So slowly and methodically looking at it, what's wrong with being trillions of dollars in debt if everything seems to be working fine, and it's getting better as they borrow more?
Yeah, well, the problem is at some point people expect to be repaid, and that's when the chickens come home to roost, so to speak, and the whole thing comes crashing down. And I think that moment is fast approaching. I think we're nearing the end of this outrageous experiment. But and it's not going to be pretty. It's going to end in an absolute disaster, no matter what they do. If they say, well, we'll just print lots of money and make the debt smaller by printing lots of money. Well, they tried that in Venezuela. They tried that in Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
And,
okay, so we're not borrowing it from ourselves, number one. Because if we'd be the debt collector. It's right, somebody else, right? It's partly the central bank.
And that's right. It's even worse than it seems, because there's a cartel of private banks that create currency out of nothing. Then they loan this currency to us, and then we have to pay them interest. And of course, they never created the interest, so that interest doesn't even exist to pay them back. So we have to borrow even more from them to be able to pay them back for the last time we borrowed money. So it's a scam piled on top of a scam piled on top of a scam, and it is bankrupting the country. I should say it has bankrupted the country. It is going to end in disaster no matter what happens. But it's a very dangerous situation we're in. Okay,
so the borrower has been the U.S. government, right?
Yep.
Primarily from the Federal Reserve Central Bank.
From the Federal Reserve.
That's just a euphemistic name. But it's
right,
not
from a cartel of private bankers that created it out of nothing. Yep.
And the other one is from Chinese government primarily.
From China and from Japan.
But those are separate issues in a way. So looking, first of all, at all this money that's being borrowed from the so-called Federal Reserve, when when the lender gets tired of waiting for repayment, when they've just had to lend more and more and more, and they can say, okay, I'm not lending you anymore, and I want to be repaid right now. If that loan is a secured loan and there's collateral, then the collateral is lost, right? Is this loan collateralized or not?
That's a good question, and I can't speak with any certainty on this, but I've heard a lot of intelligent people talk about that the U.S. government has collateralized some of these debts and would end up giving over a lot of our natural resources, a lot of our lands, a lot of things that people would generally not want to be giving away in exchange for these debts. Now, whether that'll actually happen or not, I can't say, but it is an undeniable fact that they have locked up massive amounts of resources beyond the reach of the American people in wilderness areas and wildlife preserves and sanctuary, whatever, so that there is massive amounts of wealth locked up that we cannot access. And if a creditor were to say, hey, you owe me trillions of dollars, I would like to be paid, please, and not in worthless toilet paper Zimbabwe money, hey, why don't you take all these oil fields, all these oil deposits in Alaska or something like that.
I think that's what it comes down to, because other central bank-like organizations, such as the IMF and World Bank and things like that, which are kind of multinational central banks in a way, they have taken natural resources as repayment from countries that have defaulted on the debts, right? Yeah, I seem to remember that.
The IMF specializes in that, and they don't necessarily take it over for themselves. They hand it to their cronies. They say, "Oh, well, now you defaulted on your loan. Now what you have to do is, privatize all these natural resources, and you're going to sell it, by the way, to Bechtel and this American corporation, that American corporation that, of course, is deeply intertwined with the deep state." And I think we may be heading in that direction. In 2010, I wrote an article called "Waking Up to a World Currency." It was a cover story in the New American. And it had a companion article called The Global Fed. And at that time, it was remarkable because these people were openly talking about how they wanted to end the dollar as the global reserve system and move over to a truly international monetary system where you would have the IMF acting as a global central bank with the ability to create its own credit and its own currency. And it already has a proto-global currency. It's called Special Drawing Rights, SDRs for short. Right now it's backed by a basket of currencies, including the US dollar, the Japanese yen, the euro, the British pound, etc., and now the Chinese yuan as well. And, right now there are limits to what the IMF can do that. But what the globalists have been openly working to do, the IMF, the Communist Chinese are totally behind this idea, is once we get rid of the dollar, once the U.S. is out of the center of the financial system, we'll just move over to this global system run by the IMF and, of course, the Bank for International Settlements and the World Bank and all these elitist, deep state controlled organizations. And I think there's a very real risk that we could be headed there, even as we speak. If they could crash the economy, blame Trump, blame the ridiculous U.S. dollar and American people and the Constitution, they could totally discredit freedom, and they could achieve their next goal, which is globalizing the money supply.
Yeah, and they are fully involved in crashing the U.S. economy right at the moment.
Absolutely.
For 7 interest rate hikes in a row with none under the previous president.
Yep.
And promising more.
Yeah, and I mean, people don't even realize now, the stock market is not really a reflection of market fundamentals, right? In 2008, after the economic crisis that they, of course, engineered at that time, too, we went into new territory. You had the Federal Reserve openly intervening in the stock market. They were openly buying stocks off the stock market. They ended up owning like the Red Roof Inn hotel chain, for example. You drive down on the highway, you see the Red Roof Inn. The Federal Reserve ended up owning that. And this was unprecedented because typically the Federal Reserve, to inject new money into the economy, their main way of doing that was buying U.S. Treasury securities, U.S. Treasury bonds. They didn't normally mess with the stock market, but then after this crisis, they intervened in the stock market. They started. Well,
they lend money to private banks too, don't they?
They do, yep, through their discount window, and they can manipulate interest rates that way. Higher or lower interest rates, and they can manipulate interest rates by how much currency they allow to be in circulation. And if they contract the currency supply, raising interest rates, destroying currency by selling bonds back into the market. They can actually crash the economy and have it sucked into a black hole. And we may be heading in that direction. And, of course, they wouldn't blame themselves, right? They wouldn't blame the scam central bank system. They would blame Trump. They would blame populism and American voters and refusal to submit to, free trade and all this other stuff.
Right. Wasn't it late 2008 when they had the bank bailouts? Was it late 2008 or early 2009? I forget. Right around.
Yeah, it might have been both. Yeah, but yeah, I know exactly which one.
And they said that if talking to the Congress, if you don't agree to these bank bailouts, where we save the world and the economy by giving money to the banks instead of the people, then there will be tanks in the street and martial law. And this was a threat by the Federal Reserve, if I remember.
That's right. And a member of Congress spoke about this publicly. He said they walked into his office and said, if you guys don't agree to this, there is going to be martial law declared.
Yeah.
And they're not kidding around, right? They're dead serious.
So that would be the owner of the U.S. or other central banks would be the owner. I think there's just about a central bank in every major country now, right?
That's right. Yep.
In fact, that was one of the reasons Libya had to be destroyed.
I think
because they were thinking of bringing in a gold-based bank to share with all of Africa and make them free of central banks.
That's right. And that's not even just speculation. WikiLeaks released some documents proving that the French government and Hillary Clinton had in mind preventing the emergence of this gold dinar that Gaddafi was talking about accepting in payment for oil.
Yeah, exactly. That's why his family had to be killed and everything.
Yeah.
So that is the landlord that would come in and take charge based on that debt, which is the central banking people. The other landlord that is owning more and more of the U.S. and probably other countries is the Chinese government. So,
and again, that's by design too. They have been building up the communist Chinese dictatorship from the beginning. In fact, they helped put Mao in power. There's been a lot of books written about this. They stabbed Chiang Kai-shek in the back. They put an arms embargo on him. They boosted Mao in every way they could, and put him in power. And then it's not even concealed, right? David Rockefeller went over there in the 70s, came back and wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, said the social experiment under Chairman Mao was the most important and successful in human history.
Exactly.
You had George Soros just a few years ago say that communist China should own the new world order in the same way that the United States owned the old one. So they're out in the open now with this agenda.
Yeah, didn't you mention Chiang Kai-shek? Didn't he end up running away to Formosa before it became Taiwan?
That's right. He took the nationalist Chinese government and the nationalist Chinese people to Taiwan. And, they've been independent to this day. But just, the last few days, it's been in the news that China is threatening military force if they insist on maintaining their independence.
Yeah, exactly. So the Chinese government is already moving towards, not calling in this debt, but taking over parts of the U.S. economy now before that happens, right? I know that in Hollywood, they now own like 6 out of the 7 major production companies for movies.
Yep. They own the distribution channels. They bought, I think, the second largest American movie theater chain. They're buying land. They're buying strategic assets. They're buying as many high technology companies as they can. They bought the 3 largest, most sensitive Swedish semiconductor microchip companies have all been bought by the communist Chinese. They bought Volvo, right, the Swedish car maker. So they're buying the technology companies. They are buying everything. They're buying oil. They're buying, everything they and stealing, right? They steal intellectual property like it's going out of style. And plus, Bill Clinton, of course, gave them all of our nuclear secrets and all the rest in exchange for illegal campaign contributions in Chinagate. Should have been put in jail for treason. But, that's where we are today. The communist Chinese are going to be the overlords of the new world order if we don't, get our ducks in a row and resist this. Yeah,
so there's some flaws in this Green New Deal thing that we started talking about. And
massive.
To put it mildly. And one of them is that you save the world by going into limitless debt, right? I mean, they're talking about universal basic income. And a lot of people, especially coming out of the modern educational system, say universal basic income should have started a long time ago. It's mostly the evil, rich Republicans and people like that have kept this away from us. But the Democrats are finally revealing that all they had to do was just give everybody their income and there would be no more poverty. So why does that not work?
Yeah, well, for one, any economist will tell you the study of economics deals with, infinite wants and needs and finite resources, right? I mean, there's theoretically an infinite number of desires. If we could all have a private jet, we would all love to have a private jet, right? Why can't we all have a private jet? Why can't Congress just pass a law and say everybody is entitled, everyone has a right, a human right, a fundamental human right to a private jet?
That would make all the private jet companies rich too, because we'd all be paying for our own private jets. And
we'd all have jobs because we'd all have to make them.
Exactly. They'd need a lot more workers. It would be great.
It would be wonderful, except that we wouldn't have food, we wouldn't have water, we wouldn't have, any of the other things that we need.
We could start a new belief system and call it communism or something.
Right. And we can even point to historical examples of success, right? Cuba worked so well, as Zimbabwe, Soviet Union. It's just, why would you not want that in your country?
Right. So the problem is money. I hope you don't mind we're getting off the track a little bit, but these are all really relevant topics to why what they're talking about in Poland has problems with it, right? So if you look at money, which they want a lot of from the agreement in Poland, the climate agreement, and you say, what's money? Is it just, why can't you just print up all this paper and everybody would be rich? And it's because of what the money represents, right? If you've got 1,000 pieces of paper representing a certain amount of physical resources, or 1 million pieces of paper representing those same resources, this requires some mathematical understanding on a basic level, but there's a proportional difference in the value of each of those pieces of paper, right?
That's right. If you suddenly double the supply of currency out there, then each unit of currency over time will become worth about 1/2 of what it was before. And that's just basic common sense. And if you want proof, actually, if I were in America, I could pull out. I use them as kind of gag gifts. I have hundreds of trillions of Zimbabwe dollars, and this is exactly what Robert Mugabe said. I mean, we'll just print money, right, and then we'll just use it to do all kinds of grandiose things, like buy me Mercedes and private jets. And, before long, you literally could buy nothing with hundreds of trillions of dollars. You could buy nothing, right? People would not take it for anything, and it became worthless. They had to take it out of circulation, and people started using dollars and euros and gold. And so that's the problem. It's happening in Venezuela right now, right? The value of the Venezuelan currency has completely disappeared. A month's wages now will barely buy you anything. And, it's the same concept. The idea that we're just going to print ourselves money and print ourselves wealth is ludicrous. And it's not possible. People have to produce wealth for there to be wealth.
So if just printing a bunch of money or computer entries doesn't make anybody wealthy because prices just adjust to make that worthless, which it happens pretty quick, how do you create wealth that doesn't have that problem?
Yeah, well, you just have to actually create wealth. So things have to be produced. And, there's a misunderstanding about wealth, too. There's this idea that if we just had really good, smart central planners could create a lot of wealth. We don't need markets and prices. That's ludicrous. How would a central planner know if what they were creating was actually producing wealth or destroying wealth? Let me give you an example. In a market, if you start a furniture company and you spend $400 on every table you produce, and then you sell that table for $800, you took resources that were worth $400, added $400 worth of value to them by turning them into a table, and so you created wealth, right? You took resources and turned them into something more valuable than before, and people voluntarily gave you their money as a reflection of that. So that table is valuable to me, I want it. But if you get rid of prices, the planner doesn't know how much the resources he's using are worth, and he doesn't know how much the final product that he's producing is worth. So even if you had well-intentioned people trying to centrally plan our way to producing wealth, it would be impossible because they would have no way of knowing whether they're producing wealth or destroying wealth. They might be taking resources that in a market would be worth $1,000 and turning it into something that in a free market would be worth $10. So they're actually destroying $990 worth of wealth every time they produce a table, but they'd have no way of knowing that because they don't have any prices to send them signals about whether what they're doing makes any sense or not. So you need markets to produce wealth.
So the supply and demand flow of automatic adjustment between prices and supply and demand and things like that, those are reliable because they reflect how much something is actually wanted to be produced, right?
Exactly. And if people want something really bad and there's not a lot of it, the price will go up, and entrepreneurs will say, whoa, I can make a lot of profit if I start producing tomatoes or whatever.
Right.
And so instantly entrepreneurs will start producing tomatoes for you because they want to make profit. Whereas in a centrally planned economy, you don't have any such feedback mechanisms. You have no loss signals to tell people, hey, stop producing that. You're just destroying wealth.
Right.
So you by definition need a market to be able to produce wealth so that you can actually know that you are producing wealth and not destroying wealth.
So this would be called free market capitalism, basically. But
Exactly.
not what we have in the U.S. now, but real free market capitalism.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you get back to a question that the founders of America had to deal with, of whether or not to give any power to a central government. And I think one of the powers that, if they had foreseen the future, would have probably been needed is, what if somebody wants to make profit by selling something that's going to kill everybody? Should that be left to the free market and let them deceive everybody into buying it? Or should the government be able to arbitrarily say, you can't make this material here?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, I think if there was fraud involved, I think, we have mechanisms in place to deal with that. If a businessman comes to you and says, hey, I'm going to sell you this product and it's going to cure your cancer, and then you drink it and you die, your heirs can take that company.
It's going to affect the market for it in the future, too, right? If people see that you died after it.
Oh, exactly, right. Your reputation will be ruined. You'll never sell another thing, and you'll be held accountable, right? Because you promised that was going to cure someone's cancer. Instead, it killed them. So, your whole company is going to be sued out of existence. Yeah. All your assets are going to go to compensate your victims. And so, the free market deals with these things quite well if you have an honest court system.
So what happens if you get a company like Monsanto, which is now Bayer, and they're selling things that do cause cancer and do a lot more damage than just cancer, and they are allied with a bank, even if it's a foreign bank, giving them enough funding to deceive the public into thinking this is cutting-edge science and biotech is really wonderful?
It's so interesting that you asked that, Richard. We actually use Monsanto as an example in my classroom. A company like Monsanto would be inconceivable in a true free market. Why? Because their entire business model depends on outrageous government intervention. If they could not patent the DNA forms, whatever, I wouldn't even call them life forms. This is these Frankenstein things they're creating. We're going to mix the DNA of a toxic bacteria with a corn so that the corn produces toxic waste so that when bugs eat it, they die. If you couldn't patent that under a system of government intervention, you couldn't profit off of that. You couldn't bully people into use. So the whole entire business model of Monsanto would be inconceivable in a true free market.
What about the companies that have convinced us through modern science and ag education that organic agriculture, which I have a lot of background in, is no good, and if we didn't poison all the food while it was growing, we'd all starve to death? And people believe this, and so they buy millions of tons of this stuff, which now pollutes the water tables and everything else. What should be done with products like that? What would happen with that?
Yeah, I think, again, the free market would play a very important role in restraining this kind of thing. For example, you mentioned polluting the water supply. In a free market, if a company comes along and starts polluting the water supply or polluting somebody else's property, they would be immediately held accountable. You may be allowed to pollute your own property, but the second that pollution crosses onto my property line or gets into my water and pollutes my property, that's the second that you've gone too far, and I can take you to court and hold you accountable. A jury will award me damages. And so, again, that business model becomes inconceivable in a true free market with strong protections for private property.
Okay, so you would not have to have just a free market. You'd have to have an honest court system. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, you would need basic rule of law. You would need strong protections for private property, and you would need I think an honest court system is critical, and a system of private property, because, if I'm not an anarchist, and I think anarchy has a number of key flaws, and one of them is that it doesn't include, and anarchists will tell you, well, we would have a free market court system and all that kind of stuff. I personally am not a believer. I think the court system that our founders envisioned was very good, a system where you have trial by jury, a system where you have, an entity that everybody recognizes its authority, and everybody must recognize its authority, and not a system in which the government makes all the decisions. I think that's one of the reasons our founders were so brilliant in what they created, because what they did was they built a court system, but where people are ultimately the deciders, right? In our court system in America, it's not some judge who sits up on a throne and makes pronouncements. Your fellow citizens do, right? I mean, you get called in for jury duty, and whether it's a criminal case or a civil case, depending on where you live and how things work there, the jury makes these kinds of decisions. Unless you waive your right to it, and that's a whole other matter. But I think that's so important, because if the moment you have a central authority making all these decisions is the moment you open up the door to corruption. Then someone's just got to bribe the judge, or somebody's got to just threaten the judge, and then suddenly everything, gets all messed up. So I think the system the founders developed was absolutely brilliant. It may not have been perfect, but it's, as far as I can tell, by far the best one we've had in what I can see of human history. And I think if we went back to a model like that, I think it would solve not every problem that humanity has ever encountered. I mean, we live in a fallen world. There's disease, there's poverty, there's suffering. You can't solve all these problems with a political system, but you would solve most of the political and economic problems, I think, that plague our society right now.
How much of the solution is the system, and how much of it is having the people in the system that actually are, ethical people who are conscious? Well,
I think that's interesting, because when America was founded, we did have, I would argue, a much more moral population, right? America was overwhelmingly Christian. Probably 99 out of 100 would have been, Protestant Christians, and they had a system of morals. God said, don't steal, don't cheat, don't lie, don't, all these things that were inculcated into children from the time they were kids. Nowadays, you have the government, quote unquote, educating these people, teaching them that, there is no morality, and morality is relative, and killing is wrong because society says it's wrong. But if society didn't say it was wrong, then maybe it wouldn't be wrong.
Exactly, right.
So you get these kids who grow up and they think, well, I'm just going to get a gun and shoot all my classmates, for example, right? And it's outrageous, but unfortunately, that's the reality that we're living in. So I think, in conjunction with moving back toward a freer political system, we also need to move back toward becoming a more moral population. And unfortunately, the two go hand in hand. If you have immoral people require government to guide them and to protect the innocent.
Yeah, and even that doesn't work if the government is also immoral.
That's right, and the government will become immoral if the people are immoral. The government is a reflection of the people, and if you have a wicked, corrupt population, they should very much expect to end up with a wicked, corrupt government, and I think that's what we're seeing right now in the United States and all over the world.
So if you had those kind of moral people that would make a potentially good government, and I agree with you, I see the benefits of anarchy when the whole world has a very high consciousness and there's nothing to defend against. But in the real world as it exists now, one of the functions of the government is, defend the borders of every country against people that are not going to contribute positively to it. And there's some other things too, and that's, watch out for things that somebody might start in your country that somehow gets through the system is a danger of just wiping out everybody before they figure out what's happening, stuff like that.
Yeah,
but it's limited powers.
Yeah.
And if people like that had a high degree of ethical consciousness had been the delegates to the Poland conference, what would they have done that would be constructive? I think that would be kind of interesting to see how that would have gone.
But to start with, instead of flying in, it would have been wildly different. Instead of flying in on taxpayer-funded private jets and limousines, they would have just used this marvelous thing called teleconferencing. Right? And they could have
that's right. I've heard of that. Right.
Oh, can you imagine? They could have saved us $500 million just doing that. But in all seriousness, they wouldn't have had this conference. Right? I mean, there would be no need to talk about divvying up the wealth of the Western world to third world dictators and shutting down production and CO2 emissions. I mean, this whole conversation wouldn't have happened, right? If you wanted to have a productive international conference, you could have governments coming together and saying, hey, we have a real problem with tyranny in the world, right? You have mass murderers and gangsters running around pretending to be a government,
That's
killing.
What I'm thinking about, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and, there's a lot of real problems in the world there's even real environmental problems that ought to be solved.
Yeah, exactly. I having been in the whole health investigation arm of it for a long time, I know that real health information is violently suppressed in the U.S. and most of the world with intimidation and murder. And we've had more than 100 doctors killed for talking about little bits of it in the last 2 to 3 years in America. But that's only one example. real energy information is as much or more suppressed as real health information. And we have information that solar and wind is nothing. It's very inefficient compared to what's really available. And there are clean and cost-free technologies for producing energy that have been available, according to some sources, for more than 100 years. And I know indirectly of several of the people that are sitting on these that are hiding in fear of government and corporate agents. And that coming out in a sudden way that couldn't be stopped would really have an environmental impact.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I have a friend who has rigged his car up to use water in addition to the fuel, and he gets something like he uses something like 80% of the fuel that a normal car would use, and this is something he rigged up at home on his own.
Exactly.
A layman can do. So there's all kinds of stuff like this, but the fact is, the deep state, if you will, the powers that be, don't want people to be independent. They would rather that we have to beg them for unreliable, crummy energy, for terrible food that's going to make you unhealthy, for terrible medical care that's likely to kill you. That's the system that they want. They don't want free, prosperous, healthy people running around with time on their hands to go out and do something useful and break free from the establishment's grip. So that's unfortunately the reality of the world that we're living in. And as long as people are buying into things like the man-made global warming hypothesis and these types of hoaxes, we're never going to get serious about solving the real issues that need to be solved and moving toward a significantly better future.
Yeah, a real conference would be incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Because you mentioned, for example, single-payer healthcare, which is a big part of the Green New Deal that people are all excited about, because finally everybody, what they call it is equal access to healthcare, right, all over the country and the world. And they don't really think about what it's equal access to.
Equal access to the same quack medicine and
It really is, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And to rationed care, you've outlived your usefulness. You're just a useful eater. You're 70 years old. Come on, you had a good life. Make way for, save those resources for other people like David Rockefeller, right?
Yeah. Well, and there was a famous movie with, or a video with Bill Gates in it saying, would it be a good idea to spend that $10 million or $1 million on the last 10 years of life for this person who's practically dead anyway? Or should we not fire those 10 teachers because there's scarcity and we have to choose one or the other?
And when you have the government making those decisions, they're inevitably going to make the wrong ones. So that's why I say, again, people need to be allowed to be free. People should be free to make their own decisions. People should be free to accept the consequences of their own bad decisions if they make bad decisions. Yeah. And, when you centralize power in the hands of a government, you end up inevitably with disaster, right? I mean, look at the democide numbers. Governments have killed hundreds of millions of people just in the last century. How many more need to die before we wake up and say, wait a minute, maybe that wasn't such a good idea? We're
being educated to be afraid of freedom.
And to love government.
People who are free go crazy all the time, right? Yep. That's why all what they call gun violence is happening. Too much freedom.
Yeah, and that's what we're working on right now is exposing this whole system. The government's education system is trying to eradicate an understanding of freedom. Right? Our founders in America said the purpose of government was to protect people's inalienable rights. They said it's a self-evident truth that God created you and God gave you rights, and that the purpose of government is to protect those rights. In government schools, they're learning exactly the opposite. There is no creator. You have no rights. The United Nations will take good care of you, and shush, right? And that's where we are. And so that's why we're making this such a big focus of our work right now is the education issue, because as long as the kids are being force-fed this garbage, there's going to be no hope of breaking free.
When you say our work, you're referring to the New American Magazine?
Yeah, I'm working with a good number of people on this project of the New American. We're going to have a special issue coming out in early February dedicated just to this topic. I'm working with, among others, Dr. Duke Pesta, who runs the Freedom Project Academy where I teach. And that's one alternative for people who want to get out of the government school system. There's plenty out there. And then we're working with Israel Wayne, who's one of the leaders in the homeschool community. And we just, we basically want to show parents that, hey, you got to get your kids out. Everybody likes to think, oh, well, if we just elect the right person to school board, then suddenly everything's going to be okay. No, it's not going to be okay, right? I mean, we've shown over and over and again that this trying to reform this system is futile. It's just like you might as well go bash your head against a brick wall. You'd get better results. So.
Yeah, I heard that in California, they're really making big strides forward in education, and they're teaching, as a matter of policy, that came out in a document, that kids, by the time they're about 5 years old, they need to be taken in private with a group of adults to explain that they're probably not the right sex, and that the number of genders is increasing constantly. It's unlimited, and they've been, suppressed into thinking that they're a particular sex, and it just goes on from there.
Yeah, that's literally where we are. I mean, the UNESCO, the UN's education agency, has new global sex education standards, and by the time children are 5 years old in kindergarten, they want to start teaching them the transgender stuff, the LGBT, abortions, masturbation. Pick your thing. The UN wants to teach it to your 5-year-old, and it goes downhill from there, unfortunately. Yeah,
it's a little different than the village schools that were started in the early part of this country's history, right? Mm. So, well, as kind of a takeaway from the climate conference in Poland on a larger scale, kind of a broad vision, they're trying to impose giving up your rights to save the earth, and that if you pay the carbon exchanges, the climate's going to stop changing. Number one. But the other thing is, what positive thing can be learned from that could affect people's lives in a good way, do you think?
Well, I think the positive takeaway is that less and less people believe this stuff. You have even governments around the world now waking up and saying that we're not going to go along with this hoax anymore. Donald Trump has called it a hoax. The new Brazilian government has called it a hoax. You're getting more and more governments that are waking up. And, I think it's gotten so ridiculous now that I think any sensible person who looks in from the outside of this bubble to see what's going on in there must immediately recognize that this is a farce. And so there is good news coming out of this. But I don't think the battle's over. I think we've got still a lot of work left. There's still something like 6% of Americans believe the establishment media. I can't imagine, why, but there are still, a fringe minority out there who believe what they're told on the TV. And so we've got a lot of work to do, but there are, I think, reasons to be optimistic as well.
Yeah, I agree. And hopefully, as you get into more of your educational project, maybe you can come back and let us know what's happening with that.
I'd love to.
That would be fun. Okay, well, thanks for being with us again, Alex. I look forward to next time, and hold on and we'll say goodbye in the break here.
Hey, thanks so much.
Okay, you guys, that was Alex Newman. He's become a good friend of ours and a repeat guest on Lost Arts Radio. Hope you enjoyed getting his insight from the conference in Poland. And, it's made me think a lot, what would a good conference like that actually be? Let's say that you wanted to have the climate be as good as possible, and not the radical changes that are happening to it undeniably now due to geoengineering primarily. And just having a conference like that to do good things for the world instead of a fraud. And of course, you'd have a big problem, because every time a group gets together to do something like that, the real rulers show up and infiltrate it and tear it apart. But just assuming that was somehow dealt with and wouldn't be a problem, the first thing you'd have to do to help the climate be as stable and comfortable as possible is to have the air forces of all the countries that were really caring about negative climate change, have their air forces go up and escort all the geoengineering airplanes to the ground. I don't think it's necessary to destroy them, although they certainly deserve it, but no need for that. They could just be escorted down to the ground and have them land, arrest the pilots, find out who the bosses are, make deals with the pilots to go after the head rulers of the whole geoengineering program, and indict and arrest them all over the world. I think that would be the first sensible anti-climate change agenda item. After that, it would be to release the forbidden energy technologies, because even though I don't think there's any shortage of oil or coal or anything like that for the foreseeable future, there hasn't been a need for them, according to some brave researchers, including Stephen Greer and others like that, for at least 100 years. They're great for starting wars, as an excuse for starting wars, and when you have spills of big amounts of oil and things like that, they really do make a mess in the ocean and on the land, and they're never totally cleaned up with the technologies that we use for that now, although better ones exist, of course. So releasing the free energy technologies that are clean, they don't cost anything to run. I mean, they have some big advantages. They make solar and wind look like Stone Age technologies or worse. That would be the item number 2 on a real, energy conference like that, or climate change conference. Other ones would be change agriculture, phase out the toxic agriculture that's polluting the whole planet, and move it over to an agriculture beyond what they call organic right now. And I'm talking about full use of rock dusts, which can be produced cheaply all over the world for the best mineral fertilizer that I've ever seen, and then growing material on site, especially on large agricultural lands, for mulch, and almost zero need for tilling the soil anymore. Which I've done a lot of experimenting with, and it works much better, much closer to the way nature makes soil fertile. And then you feed the soil, and the soil feeds the plants, and you know that the only source of nitrogen for agriculture on the whole planet is the atmosphere. And there are organisms in the soil already designed perfectly to take the nitrogen from the atmosphere, integrate it with the ecosystem in the soil, etc. That's a big subject, but you could have that kind of things discussed in a real climate conference. I'd love to see that happen. I don't think that's too likely to happen until consciousness gets there, because most of the people pushing what they feel are environmental things, like trying to fight global warming by austerity and nonsense like that, that's totally not necessary. They're falling for this point of view of fixing things with total government control, higher taxes, take the money from all the so-called rich people, which the real rich people are not going to pay any taxes anyway. The trillionaires they write the rules. When somebody like Buffett talks about, well, I pay more taxes than my secretary, and that's wrong. They don't want to pay any more taxes than that. That's a complete fraud. They want the rich people identified as those who still have successful businesses and companies, and they're trying to make it. They should be taxed to put them down on the level of poverty with the rest of the serfs in utopia, and everybody living happily in austerity. That's complete brainwash nonsense. And in a real climate conference, the means would be exposed for prosperity to be generated with no government handouts required. And the thing that they have to realize there too is that in the broader sense, when you create prosperity in the natural way with freedom, not toxic freedom, but freedom out, not with Monsanto dominating and things, but companies that are making businesses by actually making things better for people, for real, not just as a slogan. Then what happens is private charity groups spring up, as they have in the past, and they just, the benevolent religious groups and other kinds of service groups that really are service-oriented, they start making charity available to anybody who can't work or is too old or who really needs it. And virtually none of it has to come from government. It's really beautiful. And it's been forgotten, but that's what happens automatically in a real free market capitalism system, which we do not have in America. I don't know any country that has it right now at all. But it creates massive amounts of freedom when you even start approaching that kind of system. And everybody should be a complete environmentalist in the real sense, because what's called the environment is the life support system of the entire biosphere, including humans. Anybody that knowingly pollutes or ruins it is not very bright. And those kind of things, I think, are reasonable for government to prohibit. But total freedom to do things that are actually beneficial, I think, is great. Accumulate money, don't waste, a system that wastes almost none of it on taxes. There were other ways that the government in America was making all of its money before the income tax was imposed in 1913, making believe it was going to be a tiny bit forever and be temporary too. The whole Capitol in Washington, D.C. was built without any income tax. There are other ways to run government that are way better, and you don't have to adopt a progressive income tax, which is a plank of the Communist Manifesto for a reason. It's because it works against freedom in a lot of ways and takes away incentive to be creative and work hard and things like that. There are better ways to do it. There's so much exciting stuff that could be talked about in a real climate change conference. And I look forward to a time when that happens. And I think what's going to make it possible for that kind of thing to occur is not exactly how you set up the laws, not what you stop people from doing, but consciousness itself. Something that's become a cliche that people think is just a new agey belief system or something. It's not. That, like the environment, might be being used as a fraud right now, but there's a reality behind it, just like there is behind environmentalism, that it's absolutely essential and vital, but not in its fraudulent form. And the same with consciousness, that if you have consciousness and awareness in people, then the systems that they come up with have better results. And they're always based around freedom. And people in government and positions of power being there truly for service, not to become billionaires, not to even become millionaires, or not to just have a power trip of, like in city council meetings, when they have the council is raised up above the peasants who are at the meeting, and they get to talk down to them and ignore them when they're speaking and stuff like that. It wouldn't be like that. In a conscious society, gradually those conscious people would become the ones in position of power, not for power trips over others, but to really try to give everything they could, because they knew by experience, not a belief system, but their day-to-day experience in everyday life, that they're connected to everybody else. So what they do to or for anybody else, they do to themselves. It's not a belief. It's not a list of ethical principles you have to memorize or anything like that. It comes out of who you are. So self-awareness, I think, is the missing link to all this stuff. And if the nice thing about that, even though we don't see a lot of it around right now, to say the least, is that there's a lot of it in every one of us. There's a huge amount of it, unlimited, inside you, wherever you are in the world, whoever you are, whatever belief system you come out of, who you really are is the same essence. If you get in touch with that, it's better than getting in touch with unlimited gold mines. It's so powerful, it can actually change the outside world. And what I've come to in all the taboo knowledge areas that I've gotten in touch with and investigated, that's the one that's the biggest taboo. That's why it has to be made to look ridiculous and worthless and powerless and not worth pursuing, is because it is. And it's very much tied together. To really use it, you got to get your health together, not be addicted to all the medical drugs, but find out the real health information and then start using that to do your real work, which is all in the consciousness realm. And you can't really do that too much publicly now if you're really doing it, because it's not acceptable to the power structure. So we set up a separate private platform for people that want to get into that. And I estimate that there's maybe 1 in 1,000 people in the general population that would have any idea what I'm talking about and would, more than that, be willing to do the work to unleash it inside themselves and revolutionize their whole life experience and what they could contribute to life in the world. If you're one of those, then really I'm looking for you, and you might want to try meeting me at Getting Access at planetaryhealingclub.com, and I'm going to be there live every week, and we'll interact and actually put some of this stuff into motion. So go there if you're up to it, planetaryhealingclub.com. Otherwise, we'll have continuing free videos on on all the major social media platforms for now. If we get kicked off, check brighteon.com, which is a great platform started by Mike, our friend, and his last name, I have to separate it a little for the AI bots, is Adams. You may have heard of him. He's doing some really good work. Brighteon.com, BRIGHTEON.com. It's an alternative platform where they don't censor people for just telling the truth about things that bother the establishment. We'll be there anyway, and you can always keep track of us on LostArtsRadio.com, also on Blog Talk Radio, blogtalkradio.com/LostArtsRadio. All of our archives going back 5 years on the audio side are there. A Facebook group for Lost Arts Radio is available. Communicate, let us know feedback from shows, suggestions, comments, questions, anything. Richard at LostArtsRadio.com will read all of them and respond as much as possible. Maybe even put them into a new video. If you have a subject that you want us to make a free video on, just let me know. And if it's something I can talk about publicly, I'll do it, because I really enjoy the two-way communication. And I appreciate your giving us some of your time. It's very valuable, and you're just very much appreciated. I think what you're doing is valuable, and trying to implement good things in your own life is much more powerful than you know. Every second is an opportunity for that. So thanks for being here, and I will see you next time.
Introducing Lost Arts Radio Live, our new Saturday late afternoon, early evening 1-hour live stream show. This new show precedes our Planetary Healing Club, which starts at 9 p.m. Eastern and 6 p.m. Pacific. The Planetary Healing Club, which is not free and open to the public, but you can join for a minimum donation of just $10 a month. Our new live stream show, which is free, starts Saturdays at 7:30 p.m. Eastern and 4:30 Pacific. It can be accessed by going to lostartsradio.com/live. You can tune into our live stream from our Facebook page at facebook.com/lostartsradio, from our YouTube channel at youtube.com/lostartsradio, as well as both Periscope and Twitter at Lost Arts Radio. You can ask questions during the show by using the chat function on YouTube, or make a comment on Facebook during the live stream. Once again, that's Lost Arts Radio Live, Saturdays at 7:30 Eastern, 4:30 Pacific. As of January 2018, the Saturday live call-in show is now an interactive video platform called the Planetary Healing Club. The cost is just a $10 minimum monthly donation, automatically billed through your PayPal account. Sign up at lostartsradio.com/club. The Planetary Healing Club is every Saturday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. You get your link to participate in the show upon signing up as a member. Those shows are also archived as well for club members. Listen to our new shows with guests every Sunday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. All Sunday shows with guests have archives freely available on our website at lostartsradio.com. You can also find them at blogtalkradio.com/lostartsradio, as well as our YouTube channel, youtube.com/C/lostartsradio. Mixcloud at mixcloud.com/lostartsradio. And finally, look us up under the podcast directory on iTunes. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/lostartsradio, or on Twitter at Lost Arts Radio. Be sure to join the free Lost Arts Radio Facebook group as well. Just search for Lost Arts Radio Group within Facebook. You can also join our forum on our website if you want to interact with other listeners. We also have links to all of the great independent musicians whose music we feature each week on Lost Arts Radio. When you do your Amazon shopping, please use Amazon's Smile program at smile.amazon.com. And when you choose Lost Arts Research Institute in Sedona, Arizona as your charity, Amazon will donate 0.5% of whatever your order total is to Lost Arts Research Institute to help fund the building of the school and keep our radio show on the air. Please visit lostartsresearchinstitute.org for more information on the school we want to build. Be sure to sign up for our free weekly newsletter on our site under the Radio Show tab or right from the button on our Facebook page. Contact Richard at richard@lostartsradio.com or myself, Doug Diamond, at doug@lostartsradio.com. Thanks again for listening to Lost Arts Radio, and we'll see you again next week.
See how when you hold me, how gently I unfold. See how you can really just open me wide. See how my heart shatters, how easy it is to break. Careful now, can you feel the ground? It is beginning to shake. Pry me away, hey, 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 yeah. Pry me away, hey, hey, yeah. Pry me away, hey, 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 yeah. You can, I don't think you can. Feel how cold the air can be, how he can be lost so quickly through the window of opportunity, just like a draft in the night. See how words can twist and hands can ring like phones inside empty homes when nobody's there to hear. Oh, do you hear me, dear? Oh, pry me away, hey, 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 yeah. Pry me away, hey, hey, yeah. Pry me away, hey, 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 yeah. If you can, I don't think you can. We are black and blue. There are more than two colors to be here, and this history won't make me. Oh, oh, yeah. Pry me away, hey, 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 yeah. Pry me away, hey, hey, yeah. Pry me away, hey, 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 yeah. If you can, I don't think you can. I don't think you can. I don't think you can. See how when you hold me, how gently I unfold. See how you can really just open me wide.